Hey everybody, my name is Nick Speed. I am the founder of Ujima. We are a nonprofit service provider that cultivates community through food justice, environmental stewardship, and youth empowerment. I have a little bit of background in youth education. I have about 5 or 6 years of experience, ranging from pre-K all the way up to high school. Most recently, I was working at Gateway Greening as a youth educator, working primarily with pre-K through 5th grade. And so through that process, I began to educate myself on Verma Composting, as well as doing lots of interactive activities with the kids. And so through that process, I've kind of, gradually learned more and more about worms and the science behind the amazing things that they do, and then also just overall general knowledge about vermicomposting systems. I really want to make this, an open conversation, not just me talking. So I don't really know what everyone's background or experience is with composting or vermicompost, but feel free to share your thoughts or your experiences as well in the chat. Even though I've had some experience and I keep worms myself, I'm definitely not I'm definitely not the expert that knows everything. So definitely want to just share just a part of my experience as well. So just to start off generally, just want to talk a little bit about just what compost is and that process. So basically, when we're talking about compost, the decomposition of food scraps or any plant parts or materials. And so in this process, you need sun, which heats up the matter. You need air as well as water, and then you need brown stuff, which is basically your dead plant parts, which provides carbon into the mix. And then you have your green stuff, which is your living things like that are recently clipped, like grass clippings, food scraps, things of that nature. And those things add nitrogen into the mix. And so when you mix all of those things together over time, that once was living matter starts to break down. And then and the end result, when you have all these decomposers breaking this matter down, you have what you would call finished compost, which is also used as fertilizer on other plants. Whether you're talking about trees or vegetable gardens or flowers. It really is a step towards sustainability because it prevents that material that would most likely end up in a landfill and causes all types of things like methane gas, and which causes all types of issues with climate change. And so just the act of composting, I think, is really beneficial and something that you can use, especially if you're actively gardening or farming. The difference between compost and vermicompost is literally just the process of intentionally adding worms or earthworms into the mix. And so oftentimes, especially when you have an outdoor composting system, worms are typically active in that system anyway. But when you're focusing on vermicompost, it's really maintaining an environment in which your worms can thrive. And so just a few things on vermicomposting and why it's beneficial. You're actually able to compost things faster. So worms eat half of their body weight each day. There are several types of vermicomposting farms that exist in the country. And so when you have these larger systems, you can have a setup in which, you know, you are basically breaking down hundreds of pounds of food scraps per day. And so, yeah, worms are healthy eaters, and they don't discriminate. They pretty much eat everything or anything. There are some exceptions, but yeah, for the most part, they're really great at breaking down any type of, you know, food scraps and stuff like that. Also one cool thing about worms is that they are pathogen controllers. So they have the ability to get rid of bacteria, the bad bacteria that exists in the soil. There's been tests that have shown worms can actually get rid of lead that exists in the soil as well. So they are, yeah, really nature's recyclers, and they really have the ability to break down things because they have really powerful digestive systems, which just allows them to break down mostly anything. And then also, especially when you're dealing with the soil that's in your garden, the presence of worms is really, really crucial because worms are aerators, which means when they're digging the tunnels underneath the ground, that is allowing oxygen to get through to the soil, which is beneficial to the plants that are growing in the area, as well as the other microorganisms that exist in the soil. There are also mini tillers. So while worms are digging their tunnel, they're also recycling pretty much everything that they come in contact with. So any dead parts, any soil, all of that gets regurgitated through its system and mixed in with the soil. And so, yeah, that is one of the reasons why worms are considered ecosystem engineers, because just their presence alone can greatly impact the quality of the soil and the ecosystem that exists in those spaces. And then also with vermicomposting, you can create products. So you can have compost tea, or you can harvest the worm castings, which is basically their poop, and put that directly into the ground, and that can be fertilizer that you can utilize, as well as soil amendments to increase your plant health, as well as helps plants resist diseases, as well as pests as well. So many different benefits overall to having a vermicomposting system, even if it's just a small bucket that you have in your home, or if, you know, to the large scale vermicomposting farms that exist. And so the next thing I wanted to talk about is basically worm bins. So I would highly recommend, especially if you compost already, to consider vermicomposting because they're so low maintenance. Yeah, I think worms are some of the best pets that you can have. They don't make any noise. They don't shed hair all over the place. Yeah, they're awesome, and they turn your food scraps into fertilizer. So many benefits, like I mentioned earlier. But yeah, I definitely would recommend you, especially if you're composting already, to give vermicomposting a try. And so when it comes to your vermicomposting bins, there are many different types. So I have a tower. Let me switch my camera. Okay, so I have a 3-level tower here. And so this was purchased online. So I got this from, it's called Uncle Jim's Worm Farm. And so I can share the information, but they have worm bins like this. They have bedding that you can purchase. You can also purchase worms from them. However, I do not recommend that you purchase worms online. The times that I bought worms online, unfortunately, they arrived, most of them were dead. And so I think the time of year also had a lot to do with it. I purchased them during the winter. And so worms definitely need to be in a temperature regulated space. And so if you are purchasing worms, I would definitely recommend buying them somewhere locally. And so I have some suggestions for y'all that I'll share later. But in terms of the vermicompost bin itself, there are many different styles. There are the towers, like I have. There are more smaller bins that you can purchase. So for the system that I have, including worms, it costs about $150 for everything: the bedding, the tower, and the worms. And so if you're on a budget, there are many different routes that you can go about. On Amazon, you can find worm bins anywhere from $20 to $200. And then you can always build a do-it-yourself worm bin as well. And so I have a couple of links that I can show y'all real quick. Let's see. Yeah, so the Environmental Protection Agency, and then Backdoor Survival, and then Suburban Steeder, they have some do-it-yourself bins that you can utilize. And then I'll be sure to share this document that y'all have a chance to utilize later. But yeah, many different types of bins that exist out there. But if you do have money in your budget, I would recommend Uncle Jim's worm tower. It's, for me, I think it's awesome because it's easy to move around the basement if I needed to. I've sometimes done lessons with youth, and I've actually been able to like put this in my car and pack it up and take it places. So for me, I appreciate the fact that it's pretty versatile. And so it came with 2 levels. But I've had this for about 9 months now. And so since then, I've added an additional 3rd layer on top because I'll show you in a minute. But that 2nd layer is pretty much all the way broken down. And so I just added an additional layer and added some bedding in there that I'll show y'all in a second. So when it comes to worm bedding, there are many different types of things that you can use. And here I have peat moss, which is considered like a seed starter. And then I have also some newspaper clippings. Let's see that, like this. And then, let's see a couple worms in there. But so with the bedding, you can really get creative with it. You can use things like straw. You can use grass clippings from your lawn. You can use aged compost. You can use shredded cardboard. Really any type of shredded paper, as long as it doesn't have like that glossy texture on it. And then most of the times you want to check and make sure that as long as it has like black ink, color ink is okay. But like I said, as long as it doesn't have that glossy material of the paper, that's totally fine to shred up and put in there. You can also use dead leaves as well, because ultimately the worms are actually going to eat the bedding as well. So yeah, you can definitely get creative and just kind of utilize what you have. So I bought, when I bought this online, it came with basically a bundle. So I got this tower, and then it also included a brick of the peat moss that I just broke down in a 5-gallon bucket and slowly added in each level. Let's see. In terms of the worms' diet, so worms love vegetable scraps, fruits, non-citrus fruits, Use tea bags, coffee grounds, coffee filters, dried leaves,
Hey,
napkins.
hey, Nick, we have a quick question.
For sure.
Someone wants to know if worm composting has to be done outside or can it be done on the porch? Can it be done indoors? Where can we keep these bins?
So this particular bin I keep inside. You can get outdoor composting systems or vermicomposting systems. But with keeping it outdoors, you just have to keep in mind that you want to make sure it doesn't get too hot. And then also in the wintertime, you'll have to do your due diligence to put extra covering over the system to make sure, you know, the worms don't freeze in the winter. And so, yeah, you can do it either way, honestly. And yeah, don't be intimidated about having an indoor vermicompost system. You don't have to worry about smells, especially if you do not include things like meat and dairy. When you include those type of things in your vermicompost, that can really increase like the smell. And then also when you're feeding, making sure you're burying the food scraps. So here's a little bit of some of the food scraps there. They've already started to break that down. So that was some broccoli and some strawberries that I basically just cut up and broke down into smaller pieces and then just kind of sprinkled it in here. And then, yeah, just last night I put that in here and they've already started to break a lot of that stuff down already.
So Nick, do you need to break your food down into smaller chunks? So I shouldn't throw like a whole head of broccoli in there?
Right, for sure. So I can show you all what that process looks like real quick. Give me just 1 second. And so yeah, I just what I do is I keep beautiful. I keep a bag of frozen vegetable scraps in the freezer, and so whenever I'm ready to feed them, I just grab a napkin, zap it in the microwave for about 30 seconds to a minute, and then I let it cool off a little bit until it gets back to room temperature. And then I break it up into smaller pieces so it'll be easier for the worms to break it down. And I'll show you all what that kind of looks like. I try to break down the food scraps until they're about the size of my fingernail. You know, if it's a little bigger than that, it's not the end of the world, but that's just to help out the worms. And then also, when you put whole pieces of food in there, that's an easy invitation for additional decomposers to start popping up. And so while it's not a bad thing, you definitely don't want it to get to the point where it's like molding inside the bed. So yeah, give me just 1 second. Okay. And so this is some kale and broccoli that I had in a Ziploc bag in the freezer, just heated up in the microwave about 30 minutes ago. And so this is, I break down the scraps to about this size here. So just to give you, so yeah, you want about that size, about the size of your fingernail. If it's a little bigger, no big deal. But then what I like to do, since I fed this top layer already, I'm going to feed the bottom. Give me just 1 second.
Hey Nick, Erica from a red circle said that your compost is very beautiful.
Oh, thanks.
And really quick question. So can you not feed the worms hot or cold things?
So for me, I make sure the food is room temperature before I put it in there.
Okay. We have another question. Is there a reason to keep the food in the freezer?
When you freeze food or if you heat it up in the microwave, it makes it easier for the worms to eat.
Okay.
And then also it's easier to store the food if you just pop it in the freezer versus keeping it out. And then if you keep it out, sometimes it'll start to smell and stuff like that, especially if it's not in a sealed bag. So, okay. So, I got a little burlap sack on top. And so the worms have already broken that down. So I'm gonna take this.
Well, Nick, how do you know when it's like ready to use, I guess?
Oh, okay. I'll show you what that looks like in a second. But usually I kind of create a little space on the side here. And then I just sprinkle the greens throughout.
Okay, Nick, people are wanting to know, can you just add the food directly, say fresh off the cutting board, or do you have to freeze or warm it up?
You can actually put it in fresh off the cutting board, but I would say put it in the microwave for maybe 20-30 seconds to soften it up a bit to make it easier for the worms. But yeah, you can definitely use your fresh food scraps too. So yeah, put a little bit here. Okay, and then I'm gonna show you all that second layer because that part is pretty much all the way broken down. So
They can't eat the paper towel?
yeah. Yep. So this was from earlier, but here, trying to get it in the light, but once it starts to get dark brown, kind of gives you that chocolate cake consistency is when you know it's ready to go. Now, you know, there may still be a little bit of debris. As you'll see in here, there's some like random little eggshells and maybe parts from wood chip mulch or a little bit of peat moss. But for this, what I just do, because it's broken down so much, there's still a few worms left. So I'll dig through here and pick them out and put them in other layers. But for the most part, I just come in here and grab maybe 12 handfuls like this, and I put it in a 5-gallon bucket. And once I'm headed to the garden, I can just fill that that bucket up with water, and that can be used as compost tea. And I pour it right on the plants. Or you can just collect this and use it as soil amendment and put it around your plants as well, and then water. And then those nutrients will then be released into the plant that way. So it's really up to you. But yeah, this second portion here, I don't even really put food in here anymore. I just use it to collect and harvest the worm castings.
Okay, now this may be a silly question, but you said a few worms left. Where did the worms go? Did they die? Did they leave?
So the cool thing about this this setup is that the worms can actually navigate between the levels. And so I'm gonna try to angle this right. So y'all can see that at the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
those little, I don't
Spikes.
want to tip it over. Yeah, so let me see if I can. Oh Lord. Oh, give me a second, y'all. All right, so yeah, the worms actually have the ability to go through these tunnels and actually get and access other parts of this worm tower. And so yeah, that's a really cool feature. And so typically what I do is I put newspaper at the bottom. It's kind of like a floor, but the worms have the ability to slip underneath the newspaper or whatever I put at the bottom and then access those lower or tunnels, or if they want to climb up, they can do that as well. Let's see.
Can I ask a quick question about the arrangement of the towers?
For sure.
Is there like I'm thinking about like a 3 compost bin system. Like, is one of them the one you're adding food to? One of them the one that's kind of like resting, or like, is there a system there too, or how does that work?
For sure. So the first level is the oldest active level in this tower. And so there's still some worms down there, and I actually added some new bedding a few months ago. This second level, I have just kind of, I haven't added any new bedding just because I wanted at least one of the levels to give me the capacity to just harvest the castings and use them as I need it. And then this top level that I just added, this is kind of where the newest activity is happening. So I feed that level most frequently. Since there's bedding at that first level, I don't necessarily need to feed it as much. And so, yeah, I usually wait every other time to feed that bottom level. But the top level, yeah, I definitely try to feed that more often. In terms of feeding, it's usually 2 or 3 times a week. The good things with worms is that they pretty much eat anything. So if you forget to feed them, you know, they always can eat their bedding. So it's really rare in which you are kind of like overfeeding them. But then also you have to keep in mind the more food that you put in there, the more enticing that will be for other decomposers, not just the worms. So yeah, just keep that in mind. But pretty much the worms, you know, they eat, you know, pretty much half their body weight, you know, every day. So that, you know, you don't have any worries about them, you know, taking too long to break stuff down. In terms of just like maintenance, I keep a squirt bottle, which I use to keep the area damp. I'm gonna talk a little bit about worm anatomy in a minute, but worms prefer dark, damp environments. And I typically keep purified drinking water in this, just because, you know, with tap water, there's sometimes impurities, and worms have really sensitive skin. And so, yeah, I just don't want to make them grumpy. I just want to give them the best environment as possible. So I try to use, drinking water or purified water if possible when I'm keeping things moist. And so in terms of moisture, this peat moss does a pretty good job of retaining it. And so usually once a week, I will go in there and make sure that it's moist by just really just spraying on top, just like this. You don't want it like soaking wet to the point where like when you pick up the bedding, it's like dripping wet. You don't want it that wet. Because yeah, the worms can drown, but you just want to make sure that it's moist just to, it's really about helping them breathe. Worms actually breathe through their skin instead of via lungs like we do. So just making sure they're in a moist environment just to keep them happy. Let's see.
So Nick, if someone only had like a 1-layer worm bin, would the worms disappear then? If they had nowhere to go, would they escape?
No, they'll still stick around. You know, and honestly, when you have just one level, it's a little bit easier to harvest the worm castings. And then in terms of, yeah, it'll be easier to like kind of know where your worms are as well. And so they're very much in tune and like attracted to fresh food scraps. And so just keeping that in mind, if you want, you know, if you have that single layer system, you want to at least have most of the worms concentrated in one area so you can have room to harvest in one spot. So yeah, and I can share a couple of those do-it-yourself bins or just single layered vermicomposting systems. So I'll be sure to share that with y'all. Let's see. Did anybody have any questions about harvesting the castings? I talked about it a little bit.
What's the casting?
So the casting is basically the worm poop. And so that's the part that you really want to collect because like I said, you can turn it into compost tea or you can just use it as soil amendment to just add around your plants.
I have a question about the like speed or like volume, I guess. So like how much for this 3-bin system that you have, like are you able to add in at what, you know, like how much is it able to decompose?
Yeah, for sure. So I haven't officially tracked, but what I typically do is I fill up a couple of those gallon Ziploc bags with food scraps. And so typically, since we moved, I haven't been feeding this bin like I normally do. But when I'm actively feeding it, they can typically go through 2 of those gallon bags in this 3-tier system, really in a matter of a couple of months. And that's just me feeding that top and that third and the bottom layer. At this point, yeah, I'm not even feeding that second layer.
So if you're actively feeding, how often do you feed them?
Usually 2 to 3 times a week.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah, and so I typically each feeding take about a pound of frozen food, and then I try to break it up, and then I usually make like little kind of ditches on the side of each level, and then I kind of add the food there and then make sure it's buried. That way, when it comes to like harvesting, I know that I can really grab through the middle and knowing that it won't be a lot of worm activity in those spaces. Let's see. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I wanted to share about worm bins. No, I think that's it. But if anybody has any questions about that, yeah, feel free to ask. And so just wanted to talk a little bit about worm anatomy and then how that can easily lend into doing activities with youth. So try to gotta see. So this is just a small graph of a earthworm itself. And so earthworms, the cool thing about them is they are literally perfect for composting. They do not have any eyes. They do not have a nose or ears. Their entire bodies are made up of muscles, which allows them to easily navigate through the soil. And they have a really strong digestive system. In particular, the gizzard, that portion allows worms to break down all different types of materials. And then just also its skin. Like I mentioned earlier, worms don't have lungs like we do. They actually breathe through their skin. And so with that, their skin is very, very sensitive. So they do not like to be exposed to light for long periods of time. Their skin is also very sensitive to vibrations that exist in the soil as well. And so, yeah, worms are really, really fascinating creatures. And yeah, I try to share this as much as possible with the youth, because I think worms just get grouped into the category of the creepy crawlies. And, you know, oftentimes I get kids who are terrified of worms, and, you know, I just constantly remind them, like, hey, like, worms don't have teeth. They can't bite you. You know, yes, their skin is a little slimy, but that's literally so they can breathe. And so, yeah, I've definitely got some enjoyable moments, especially with the younger kids, pre-K and kindergarten, because, yeah, they're either all in or they're all out when it comes to worms.
Yeah, I have a funny memory when it comes to worms as a child. Like we had a bunch of old logs and stuff in our backyard, and I remember, I think I was like around the same age, like maybe 5 or something. I would like go and like get all the bugs and like collect all the worms from under the logs and then like stick them. I remember one day I like put them all in like a giant mixing bowl with some like mud, and I just brought it into the kitchen, and my mom was like, yeah, that's fine, you know, whatever, you just put it over there. And then like later I came back to check on my worms and they were all gone. I was like, where did they go? And we never quite figured it out. Hopefully maybe she got rid of them or took them, but
But yeah, worms are definitely some really cool and unique creatures. And yeah, just because of their unique anatomy, there are so many different, you know, science lessons that you can delve off into with kids. Yeah, from you know, just talking about their unique skin and how it's super sensitive. I'm going to talk about some activities that you can do a little bit later that talk about or really speak to the unique senses that worms have. And so even though they don't have eyes, a nose, or ears, they very much are aware. They're very much aware of their surroundings, and they very much can live a happy life with without all of those senses that we really rely on as human beings. So I had a really quick point, I thought, but I just lost it. That's all right. So in terms of activities that you can do with youth, I can definitely share this with you all later. And so this activity is really cool. You know what? I'm not going to put this up like y'all can read it. I'll just switch the camera and explain it. So, you know, obviously worms don't have a nose, but they very much can sense, especially things that have really strong odors. So one activity that I like to do is I like to take the worms and isolate them out of the bin, usually having some type of napkin or plate. And then I give each kid an opportunity to have at least, you know, 4 to 5 worms. And then I also take a cotton ball in which I dip in different items. So dip one in vinegar, You can dip one in some type of perfume or cologne. You can also do nail polish removal. Oh, my iPad battery is low. Let me plug it up real quick. So yeah, different types of scents that you can actually put on a cotton ball. And once you put the cotton ball near the worm's body, you can actually observe and record their reactions. And based on that, given an opportunity to see that, these worms are actually reacting to these different chemicals that they're getting exposed to. And so, yeah, very much an interesting activity that you can do with kids. And then also track how worms react to different scents that you have. And then also you can do one in terms of worm sense of hearing. So obviously they don't have ears, but they very much can feel vibrations. So having that same setup where you have a group of worms on plates and then take turns doing things like clapping, making vibrations on whatever surface you have the worms on, and then maybe using your phone to play some music and putting that near the worms and recording and observing their reactions. And so, yeah, because of their very sensitive skin, they can easily pick up on vibrations. It's actually one of the ways in which birds hunt worms. So if you were ever like randomly outside and like notice a bird like looking like it's stomping on the ground or hopping up and down, that's actually to mimic rain to get worms to start to come closer to the surface. And so, yeah, it's crazy how the predators and worms have picked up on their sensitivities as well. So, yeah. And then just in terms of ways to interact with youth, I just, especially when I was doing direct education, I just created open opportunities for them to observe worms. So making sure they had a magnifying glass, getting them to identify certain body parts, and then, incorporating things like math, using rulers to measure how long the worms are. Looking at, if you're talking with older kids, thinking about more so adaptations. So thinking about, why are the worms moving the way that they do? Why are they reacting to certain senses that are happening, whether it's like you flashing a flashlight on them or, you're making a lot of noise. And then one good one that I always get with the kids, ew, this worm is peeing on me. So worms, they actually have, one of their defense mechanisms is mucus. So they have a yellow mucus that comes from their pores when they are threatened. So you don't have to worry, that mucus is not any threat to us as human beings, but for smaller insects, that mucus can be poisonous and even toxic. So that's one fun one that I always like to explain to the kids. And yeah, worms can easily get stressed out. Oftentimes I have to let the kids know, it's best to let the worms kind of operate on their own, because when you start to handle and pick and pull their worms, they start to get really frantic and flip all around. And it's funny because when the worms freak out, the younger kids start to freak out. And so, yeah, it's always a funny sight. But just giving kids the opportunity to just take a minute to pause and kind of really observe the other ecosystems that are existing, especially within the soil. And so for me, I found that there are so many different lessons that you can take away from talking about worms, whether it's their unique anatomy, to talking about their behavior, to talking about just how much they improve garden ecosystems. And so, yeah, just from me doing activities with kids, I've just found just the importance that worms have, not just in agriculture spaces, but just for our planet in general. I think oftentimes, you know, the bees and the butterflies often gets the most props in terms of like their benefit to our planet. But I would also argue that, you know, worms are definitely in the top 5 in terms of like the most important organisms in terms of just the impact that they provide just from their presence alone. So I can go on and on, but yeah, as you can see, I enjoy talking about worms. I enjoy keeping them. They're super low maintenance. And then also I get the added benefit of utilizing the compost tea as well as the castings in our school gardens to help our plants grow. So for me, it's all a win-win. And definitely when I'm working with or talking with educators, definitely want to, or I definitely make sure I talk about worms and the different capabilities you can have through education. And then on top of that, there's so many existing curriculums that are out there, especially for youth education, that can be an easy connection to any science standards that are out there. So yeah, I'm definitely a proponent for that, and including that in our overall education, especially with youth. Let's see, I've talked a lot. Does anybody else have any questions or thoughts, or maybe I can go over something that maybe a question that you had that I didn't cover? More than welcome to yeah.
I have a question about just like this compost system versus others. Like, just based on what you're saying in terms of the amount of food you can kind of like give to them, and I guess it would scale up the more you have, but like, what do you think, like, because it seems like with an outdoor compost system, you can just like throw your food right in it, right? And like, that kind of works. But what are like the biggest benefits of doing like vermicomposting? Like, is it the kind of compost product that you get from it, or like, how do you weigh what kind of, you know, a focus on vermicomposting instead of another?
For sure. So just because of the worm's huge appetite, they're going to break that compost down faster than if you wouldn't incorporate worms. It's definitely going to require more work in terms of, you know, how you store your food scraps, and then making sure you break it down to manageable pieces. I personally like, you know, using scissors or a knife or even my hands to break down the food. But you can also toss, you know, food in a blender or a Vitamix to quickly break down food if you don't, you know, you don't want to go through that process. And so, and then, yeah, that final benefit for me is, I think, the ability to harvest those worm castings and use it in your garden, I think is awesome. And yeah, it's like free organic fertilizer that's right there that you're making in your home. So yeah, for me, I think it's low stakes, but then you also get many benefits out of it as well.
Another question about worms. How do they reproduce and how quickly? So like,
Ooh, good question.
I collected some worms in my backyard and put them in a bin. Like, would that also work?
So for vermicomposting systems, typically people use red wigglers. So red wigglers are, so just as a side note, there are hundreds of different species of worms, but typically when it comes to vermicomposting, folks typically lean towards using red wigglers. So red wigglers are shallow buriers, which means, yes, they like to be underground, but they usually stay within that kind of that first like 5 to 8 inches underneath the soil. They also love food scraps, and so they're perfect for vermicomposting systems. A lot of the worm species that exist kind of like in our backyard are more so the earthworms that more so soil and dirt makes up the majority portion of their diet. And so while those worms could potentially work in a vermicomposting system, they aren't necessarily ideal. And then, you know, some of those worms also like to bury a lot deeper in the soil as well, which they wouldn't have that ability in a vermicomposting system.
That makes sense. Thanks.
And then, yeah, just real quick on the part how they reproduce. So worms are hermaphrodites, so they have both sex organs. Worms become sexually active or can, or at least reproduce, I believe, in 6 months. For the red wigglers specifically, their lifespan is about 2 years. But once the 6 months hit, they can start that process of laying eggs. Worms, so the babies are actually born in little cocoons. And so I'm trying to think. Basically, in that process, the worm has, you know, segments all throughout its body, but it also has a thicker portion, what's called I think it's called the cilium. And so that is the portion of the body that houses the sex organs. And so when worms, you know, rub against each other and reproduce, that cocoon is actually formed within that larger band. And then it's exited out of the anus portion. And then, you know, yeah, within that 6 months period, you know, worms can start to reproduce. And so you can easily, especially in the right conditions, and if you're feeding it, a worm population. So like, for example, I bought like a half a pound of worms. And so the population doubled within a couple of months. And so, yeah, in the right environment and circumstances, worms can really thrive. And then the cool thing is, if it's, you know, a space in which, for example, there isn't enough food for that particular population of worms, the cocoons can actually stay dormant until the right conditions exist for it to thrive. So yeah, worms can also like control their population, and yeah, amazing creatures for sure. Anybody else have any other questions?
Along those lines, is there a point in which you would, I guess you said they can control their population, so maybe this wouldn't happen, but like, would you ever open your vermicompost bin and be like, oh, there's too many worms in here, I need to like take some out?
No. Yeah, I haven't had that issue. And then also because I have the multi-layer system, I can always transfer worms to different levels if needed.
I have one more question. I have a lot of questions apparently.
Okay.
So when you're harvesting the compost, like what we were seeing in your bin, I know you said with like peat moss or sort of like seed starter, like when you're harvesting it, can you tell, like, is there like a portion of castings to that peat moss?
Sure. So I would say there is, so from the castings that I collect, it's about 80% worm castings, 20% other stuff. And so, it's never going to be perfect, especially because I'm harvesting things by hand. And so, if you really want to get down to it, you can like filter it out and really make sure you're getting 100%, of that worm castings. Especially the Vermicompost farms, they have really elaborate systems in which they separate the worms and the castings and all of that kind of stuff. So, yeah, for me, I don't think it's a big deal if it's, not 100% worm castings, because yeah, I see it as it's gonna, add some type of benefit to the soil one way or another.
All right. Well, technically we have reached our time. So if you want to end with any closing statements, feel free.
Yeah, I definitely encourage you to utilize Verma composting systems. And yeah, if you want some more information, feel free to reach out to me. Email is ujimastl@gmail.com. And yeah, I'm super thankful for you all for having me. And yeah, always excited to share about the worm magic.
Can you share a little bit about what Ujima is and what you all do?
Yeah, for sure. So, yeah, as I mentioned earlier, we're a nonprofit. We really focus on cultivating community through food justice, environmental stewardship, and youth empowerment. Our major program for now is providing produce, herbs, and flowers to families of color here in St. Louis. We've been donating to families since May. Then we're also working on launching value-added products later on this year. We're going to be partnering with a chef that's local here, and we're going to have some high school and college students helping us make the salsa, learn how to package it, and then we're going to pay them as well. So yeah, really excited for the future. And yeah, definitely always appreciative for the opportunity to share.